Hello, Livingston Fellowship. I invite you guys to join me as we sing and come with thankful hearts before the Lord for all He's done in our lives. Let me out of the desert, brought me into His streams, rivers of living water. Turn my bitter into sweet, and all my burdens are lifted. He took the shackles off my feet, but there's no sound louder than the captive set free. So let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sing of His promises evermore. There's joy in the morning, springing up in my soul. There's life worth living, because He calls me His own. And there's a hallelujah after sweet victory. There's no sound louder than the captive set free. There's no sound louder than captive set free. So let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sing of His promises evermore. Pour out your thankfulness and let it overflow. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. You are my deliverer, the freedom I'm living in. You are my deliverer, you are my promised land. You are my deliverer, the freedom I'm living in. You are my deliverer, you are my promised land. So let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sing of His promises evermore. Pour out your thankfulness, let it overflow. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Pour out your thankfulness, let it overflow. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Amen, amen. Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where the streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name, and blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place, though I walk through the wilderness. Blessed be your name, and every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to grace. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be your name, blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be your glorious name. You give and take away, you give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. You give and take away, you give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be your name, blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be your glorious name. And I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is strong. Child of weakness, watch and pray, and find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. When my sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. My sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in him complete, Jesus died my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. My sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. When my sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus, we thank you so much for the cross. We thank you so much for paying the price for our sin. Lord, we thank you for the redemption we have in you. Lord, we thank you for one day when we stand before the throne, Lord, when we're complete. Just the joy that will be known and will be felt in that moment. Lord, we praise you and we worship you. Amen.
Hey, good morning, and thanks for joining us for this next message in this series, Navigating Life's storms. We started this series last week. I didn't know if it was going to be a one sermon one or if it was going to go longer, but here we are. This is going to be the second of 4, actually, as I've mapped it out. And today we're going to talk about going into the storm. Now, before I start, let me make 2 apologies. One, I apologize for not getting our midweek one up again. I tried. I had it done. I couldn't get it moved from my phone to my computer. I recorded it twice. I'm technologically ignorant and an absolute ignoramus, and I apologize for that. I still have an 8-track tape player, but I will get it figured out. So that leaves me number 2. I'm using my laptop computer camera, which is very, very subpar, and I apologize for that. I will keep trying to figure out how to make this work better for all of us. So thank you for being patient with that. Well, like we said, we're going into the second part of the series. We're going to be into chapter 27. Last week we left off at the end of chapter 26 at the longest story in the book of Acts. It starts at Acts chapter 21, verse 17, where Paul goes to Jerusalem, ends up being arrested. A riot breaks out. The Jews want to get him arrested because they are accusing him of creating a problem. It's really interesting. They're the ones that started, and they blame it on him. He ends up going before the governor there in Jerusalem, and then they send him up to Felix. Felix turns it over to Festus. Festus appeals to Agrippa, and we find out that that whole process lasted for 2 years. So we talked about, just like the quarantine we're going through, Paul went through a very similar quarantine, and we saw some things that we could learn out of it. Well, we're going to pick up there today, and this is actually where I started the series. I was going to talk about the storm, and I got so interested by the context that we backed up at the last part. So now we're actually getting into the chapter I wanted to look at, and I was going to do all of it today, but decided to break it up because it's really, really rich. And so we're going to talk about going into the storm. I've got a daughter that hates driving in storms. I don't mind it at all, but she hates it. When she sees it coming, it causes her to panic when she sees that storm. I've got another daughter that just does not like bad weather. And we all deal with weather differently. I grew up in Texas where we were not too unaccustomed for tornadoes coming through and creating havoc. So when I was in Indiana one time in the early 2000s, I was out mowing my yard, and the tornado sirens went off, and my kids all panicked and ran down to the basement and got in the hallway, and I kept mowing, and they were all upset and asking Mom if Dad was going to die in a tornado, and I said, no, as long as it's daylight, I can see it coming, and I don't want to finish mowing. I don't want the rain to happen before I finish mowing my yard. And so some of y'all can appreciate that. So I was trying to get my yard done before it rained, and I was fine as long as I could see it. Now, nighttime tornadoes terrify me, but daytime ones at least you can see and take cover. So how do we respond to storms? Today we're going to talk about 3 truths of a storm. We're going to look at a really difficult journey Paul has from Jerusalem to Rome, and today we're going to talk about what happens when we start into it and things that we need to understand. Next week, we're going to talk about riding out the storm. So let's start this week. If you have your Bible, your app on your phone, your iPad, go to Acts chapter 27. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12 and seeing what we can learn during this time. I'm going to have a map up so you can kind of follow along Paul's journey today and keep up with it and kind of get a visual of it. Hope that's helpful for you. But let's start in verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail from Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromatea and about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. All right, point number 1. Sounds a little elementary, but it's true. Number 1, we're all in the storm together. Notice you had Paul, you had the other prisoners, you had a Roman centurion, you had a Macedonian, you had the crew, you had the captain or pilot of the ship, he's called later. You had other passengers that were on here, probably from other nations. The point is, when you start going into a storm, it's hitting all of us together. So what does that mean for us? Well, we're all in the same boat. Self-pity doesn't make sense because they're going through the same thing that I'm going through. I can complain about it. This challenge that we're going through with this pandemic, it's hitting people on different levels, but before it's over, we're all going to be impacted by it. And so our goal is not to try to personalize. In fact, that's one of the problems we have. We personalize. Why is God letting this happen to me? We've had over 52,000 deaths, I believe, of this morning, Saturday morning. 52,000 deaths here in America, nearly 200,000 around the world, I believe. Maybe it's under 50,000. It's a bunch. And man, it is just ravaging some communities. And so we're aware of how powerful it is. And there are some people that feel very alone, that have lost, watching a special guy lost his mom, his dad, and his brother all within 10 days of this virus. And so it can be very impacting. But sometimes when we look at it, we think God is somehow coming after us personally. The fact is that we're being impacted by this storm. In South Florida, when we were there, and a hurricane would come through, people would say, "Oh my goodness, why is God bringing? Oh, we need God's judge in South Florida." He may be. I'm not smart enough to know what God's doing, but I can tell you this: hurricanes have been coming through South Florida for millennia. You may remember Flagler, that built the railroad from Jacksonville to Key West, and the whole thing got destroyed in the early 1900s. So I guess God was judging him for building the railroad, right? No. They built where hurricanes went. Don't get mad at God if you build in a floodplain and the house floods. Don't get mad at God if you build on a hillside and an avalanche comes. And so it's funny how we personalize things that might be very natural, and the fact is other people are going through it. Something else we need to consider. You have Paul the Apostle, wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, is the most sought-after theologian for us to understand so many aspects of redemption, and he had the same authority that the prisoners had, which was none. You would think God would put the godly man in charge, but that's not always the case. In fact, it's not often the case. A lot of times we'll say things like, well, if I were in control, I would. And the fact is that you probably wouldn't. There's nothing worse than a Monday morning quarterback that thinks that they could have coached that team or quarterbacked that team better than the guy who did it. If you could have, you would have been. But I'm just a consultant working with churches. I am not a quarterback, and I think I can tell people what to do. But the fact is I'm not in that position. And here's what I've learned during this whole pandemic. I don't need to wish for that which God hasn't given me. I think we need to be praying for our president, our decision makers, this council around him, our governors, our mayors that are making very hard decisions. And we may very well be smarter than them, but we didn't pay the price to be elected. We did elect them, and so we can change that in the next election. But right now, let's be praying for them. I'm going to pick that up a little bit later. So we're all in this storm together. Number 2, let's look at verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea and again passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. I want you to remember that. The winds were against us. That's not the first time that phrase or last time that phrase is going to be used. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, and again, you can follow that on the map, we landed at Myra in Lucia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So now we're changing ships. Verse 7, we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, that's another way of saying the wind was against us. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty, again because of the wind, and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. All right, point number 2. First, the storm, we're in the storm together, but number 2, the winds will be against us. When you're in a storm, it's very difficult to know where to get so that the wind's not beating you up. If it's in your face, it's blinding you. If it's behind you, it's pushing you. If it's to the side, it's knocking you off course. The point is, when you're in a storm, the winds are fighting against you. Now, it's mentioned several times. I can remember when I was running, I used to hate running into the wind. I don't know why that was such a frustration. There was an old, I think it was Bob Seger, Against the Wind. that he played. And you've heard the phrase into thin air, kind of into the storm, going into the, man, when you go into the storm, when you sail into it, you're going to go in where the winds are buffeting you. Some of you will remember the big revelation. I was living in Dallas when that L-1011 went down, landing at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport because of wind shear. And the wind hit it so hard it crashed it into the ground. There was nothing the pilot could do, and it killed almost, I think, everybody on board. Wind in the middle of the storm is against us, and it does several things. Number one, it makes everything more difficult. Because that wind's against us, it just makes everything difficult, which number two, makes us all work harder. We have to work harder to get to the same place. I remember I used to fly with my dad in a private airplane, and when you would go into a headwind, you had to account for the speed of the wind. If you were going into a 15-mile headwind, that made going 150 miles an hour actually 135, because your plane was actually having to resist that headwind. Well, the same is true in the middle of a storm. You have to work harder to get to the same place. And people say, why is it so difficult? Because it's a storm. What we're going through right now, it does make us have to work harder. We don't need to feel sorry for ourselves about that. We just need to realize it's that kind of a time. And it also makes everything go slower. Everything not only is harder, but it's like we're losing time. It seems like I cannot get ahead. I've got so many deadlines now. You would think that with this much so-called free time that I would actually have more time to get ahead. And I've got all these projects that I'm finding in a storm, it's actually more difficult to stay on track. I told Hazel, she got home Thursday night after being away 10 days. I said, I don't know what it is. When you weren't here, I couldn't find my rhythm. And it really was much more difficult to maintain my timing. And so when you're in the middle of that, these challenges are happening. So what are our wins? Well, our wins are our children who are having a hard time focusing on school. Our challenge is watching our 401ks drop and our investments struggle. If you're living on an income based on the stock market, you're facing some of those challenges. There's all kinds of winds that are hitting us from all kinds of directions. There can be the wind of trying to keep employees employed. There can be the wind of trying to maintain relationships and sanity. There can be the wind of your spouse or a child going into the hospital. We've had that in our own church. We've actually had a death of someone that couldn't have a funeral. We've had people in the hospital that we couldn't go visit, the people I've kept up with through other persons. And the challenge when you're in the middle of a storm, it makes everything harder and slower and more difficult. It's just the reality. And so we're all in this together. We're all facing the winds. What else do we see about it? Let's pick up here in verse 9. So Paul warned them. Now, we're going to pick this up a little bit later next week, and we'll follow along how we see his warning play out. But he warns in verse 10, Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives as well. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. Okay, so here we are. Number 3, third thing that we see. Not only are we in the storm together, not only are the winds against us, but there are always many opinions. So here's Paul. He's given his opinion. The pilot and the owner of the ship have an opinion. I'm sure other people had an opinion. Luke just restored the ones that reflected his interaction, right? So we see all these opinions. Now, let me ask a simple question. Why should the pilot and ship owner be trumped by a preacher? Sometimes I'll hear preachers preach this and go, they should have listened to the man of God. And that may very well be true. Paul was, I don't know if he was prophesying or if he was just so familiar with this that he was experientially smart, because there are some people that are book smart and there are some people that are experience smart. And I'll tell you the truth, when push comes to shove, I want the experiential smart over the book smart anytime. and taking my classes, and I don't mean to be, I don't want this to be a ad hominem, where I'm judging everyone, but I can tell you that my best professors were usually the ones who had some experience in doing what they were teaching me. I've taken, whether it was my theology classes at Southern Seminary or my MBA classes, I found that if people only studied and never actually ran a business, if they never actually ran a church, sometimes they had great ideas, but they would have holes in them. They wouldn't hold up. It was just theory until it had been done. So there could have been an argument that Paul, but man, this was the pilot of a ship. So here we are in a situation where I'm going to be honest with you. It's easy for us as Christians to go, they should have listened to Paul. But based on what? We've been having a very interesting, I had a friend of mine send me an article written by a guy by the name of Tom Nichols, where his presupposition, I'm sorry, I'm still struggling with my words, as you know. His presupposition is that experts are considered to be obsolete, to be not to be trusted, and it's led to some interesting conversations. I think he and I have some different views about it. I always appreciate his insight and how he sees things, but here's kind of how I've been approaching it. I don't think we ought to throw experts out, but I think we ought to determine what makes an expert and what makes an expert in a specific field. For instance, I'm really loving that we have Dr. Fauci leading us, Dr. Birx, Dr. Davis, Jerome Davis, our Surgeon General. I think we have a great medical team around our president. But the fact is, Fauci has been leading us since the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. He has experience. He's not just a smart guy. He's not just an educated guy. He's an experiential guy. That's the reason I trust him. And when he speaks, I feel like he's got such clarity about what he says. Then I'll hear all these other people who read a book or stayed at a Holiday Inn or have their PhD in something, and they all, I'm not saying that we shouldn't listen to them, but here's what I've learned. There are experts everywhere. And there's always some expert that predicted something right. But a broken clock can be right twice a day. Well, it used to be. Now in digital, I'm not sure how that works. But it's been frustrating to me because I if we'd listen to the experts. Well, one of the challenges, honestly, is that we don't know how to define the expert. What makes the expert? I've always hated this one. Anytime there's a market crash, there's someone out there selling their financial credentials by saying, I predicted the crash. Well, if you go back and read them like I've started doing, they predict a crash all the time. They just keep predicting it. You know, the stock market's not going to keep going up. Of course it's not going to keep going up. It's capitalism. It goes up, it adjusts. It goes up, it adjusts. Sometimes it crashes way down and then it works its way back up. But the point is, just predicting a crash doesn't mean you're a great predictor or prognosticator. So one of the challenges is, and sometimes in life, we're surrounded by opinions. That's the reality. And so as we process this season, this challenge, everyone's making their best educated experiential decision. Sometimes it's not a wrong decision, it's just a decision. And sometimes things that are happening around us, there's really no way to point blame, it just is. Sometimes we don't have the foresight to see ahead. There's all these, every time something happens, there's a congressional meeting to find out what went wrong and who to point fingers at. And I get that if someone has been negligent, if somebody's been held accountable, I remember watching the hearings after the 2008, and if you dig deep enough, you're going to find out that a vast majority of the policy that led to the crash of 2008 and 2009, the policy was around congressional legislation, either regulation or deregulation. And then you get into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and you get into congressional leaders that made a lot of money and partners around them and spouses or friends who made millions and tens of millions of dollars. It's interesting that the whole congressional thing led to not one single person being prosecuted for some things that seemed very unsavory if you did enough reading. And so it could lead to a lot of cynicism, or you just go, you know what? The fact is, when you get greedy, the policy may have led to it, but we all got pretty greedy and wanted more than we could pay for, and we ended up in some challenges. Look, pointing fingers and blaming just waste energy and emotional, spiritual, and mental capacity. So let's be careful. Let's be careful about passing along our opinions. My midweek challenge this week was, for every minute that you use criticizing either Republicans or the Democrats or the president or Nancy Pelosi or Cuomo or Reeves or whatever it is that we want to do, I dare you to at least pray for those same people for 4 minutes. So for every minute of complaint, criticism, and tell them you know better than they do, there ought to be at least 4 minutes of praying as a believer. And I just think we've got, look, we're in this. There's all kinds of opinions. And as my brother-in-law says, they're a lot like armpits. Everybody's got one. Most of them stink. So let's be careful during this time. There's just going to be a lot of opinions. Well, what does that do for you and for me? All right, Dan, so we're all in this together. Winds are against us. Lots of opinions. What do I do? What does Dan Hall do? What does the person listening to this do? Let me give you 3 life lessons that I hope are helpful for you in this time. Life lesson number 1, seasons in life can be tough. Let me adjust that. They will be tough. There's just some seasons that we're in because we're in those seasons. There are times that the crops don't get grown because it was just too cold. The crops got flooded out. There's times it was just too hot. And no one is to blame. It just happened. And sometimes it's just tough. It's not tough because someone's wrong. It just is. There's a phrase called anti-fragility, and it's the idea that we're to teach our kids not to be so fragile. When something is fragile, it can be easily broken. And right now we're seeing a season where everyone is offended, everyone jumps at every little thing that's said, and there's all this constant call for an apology and for people, well, you need to own what you said. And it's just, we are so freaking fragile. Life can be tough. It's just a challenge. Look at what Peter said. He says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Folks, we act like this is just I listen to some people and act like, man, I can't believe this has happened. How has this happened? Why are you acting like this is strange? Peter says. He asked the question. If some of you remember Muhammad Ali, one of the things he was most known for was his ability to take a punch. It wasn't just that he was a good boxer, it's that no matter how hard you hit him, he could absorb the hit. That's the picture we're looking for as believers, especially as believers. People who have a God that we know loves us, is for us, because he's given his son. We know that in giving his son, he'll give us all things. That this God who said there's nothing to be afraid of, that neither height nor depth nor angels or principalities, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. There's no temptation taking you as much as is common to man, and he'll give us a way of escape, that he's going to give us grace for every challenge we go through. Of all, even though it's hard, it's tough, we're against the wind, we don't really know who to listen to. We're in the middle of the challenge, but God is in the middle of it all. I loved a story I heard a coach tell one time of a boy that they had spent all summer practicing. They went out to the first game, and the guy went out and got hit by the other teams laying flat on the ground, jumps up, runs to the sideline, says, "That guy hit me." Coach looked at him, "Son, it's not ballet. Yeah, he hit you. Are you surprised?" So look, folks, yes, sometimes life is tough. It's not a ballet. And all you ballerinas, please don't get mad at me. Yes, I know it's tough, and standing on your toes is tough, and all that stuff. I don't want to take away any of that. But the challenge is this: life can be tough. Number 2, decisions are not always obvious. Can I tell you, I'm so glad I'm not President Trump. I'm so glad I'm not Governor Reeves here in Mississippi. I'm glad I'm not Governor Abbott in Texas or Governor Cuomo in New York. These people have major decisions, and I know there's a lot going on around the country about civil rights and lockdown, and I just don't. Some of it I look at and I just think it's the American way. I get it. We've got to fight and push and pull, and it's the yin and the yang that makes America work. But it's just amazing to me that look, let's pray for them. The decision's not obvious. And let me add one more thing after that ellipses that I think is important. And sometimes there's no right or wrong answer. There's just outcomes. There are times that you and I, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just outcomes we have to choose. You've heard the phrase, choose your poison. I heard that for years. And then I heard the rest of the statement. It doesn't stop there. Choose your poison, know your antidote. So whatever it is that you do, just know what the outcome's going to be and be ready to face it. There are times where the choice seems to be not, either one doesn't seem to be easy. Either one produces outcomes that you have to decide which outcome do you want. If we choose to stay locked down, we're going to have serious long-term depression globally in the economic. And then we're going to have all kinds of mental illness challenges and people losing their minds and their businesses, and there'll be all kinds of challenges. Or we can open back up and see a resurgence of the death, and we're back into overwhelming our hospitals. Look, there is a situation here where there are people that they know they're right, when in reality, there may not be an exactly right or wrong answer. We're going to have to navigate through this together. Let's pray for them. Let's stand with them. Choose your poison, know your antidote, okay? So how do we decide? Let me give you three things. You've heard this before, and I will keep saying it till the cows come home because I believe it's true. Three things. Number one, if there is no clear right answer, then start by asking, is there a wrong answer? Sometimes when I'm looking at something, I go, which one's right? Sometimes I have to flip it and say, well, is there one of these that are wrong? Is one of these an outcome that is just too devastating? Is the cost too high? Or is it something that I don't want to do? We're dealing with a situation with a particular family member that has a very serious decision in front of them. And the way they finally got to the decision is by looking at the outcome as something that he just couldn't bear up under. It was just too much. So it wasn't that there was a right or wrong decision. There was an outcome that was tenable and an outcome that was untenable. And so is there a wrong answer? Number two, ask God. You hear me say this all the time. James 1:5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously. I love that. He's not trying to withhold, and he doesn't find fault. In other words, he doesn't make fun of you for asking, and look at this, will be given to you. God, please help me. I don't know what to do. And then do what your mind is telling you to do and your heart's telling you to do. If you are submitted to God, he will lead you in the right direction. And you say, well, Dan, how do I know it's God and it's not the devil? You didn't ask the devil. God's big enough to meet you in your sincerity. And I've seen it happen over and over again. And then number three, again, you've heard this before, but let me keep it in front of you. Move forward unless you lose peace. Colossians 3:5 says, let the peace of Christ rule your hearts. I think I have the wrong verse there. It's 3:5. Let the peace of Christ rule your heart. What does that mean? If I move forward and all of a sudden I lose peace, then I back up. Now, I'm not saying that I get nervous and I'm scared about I'm saying there is that loss of peace. We all know what that feels like. And then last, no matter what happens, we have to manage our hearts. We have to manage our hearts. We have to control that. Don't let your heart become bitter, defeated, resentful. Don't let it become like I'm never going to trust again. Cultivate gratitude. Ask God to help you see how to be a blessing. I had the privilege this week of talking to a room full of people that were newly paralyzed. And I say privilege because it's a privilege for me to try to help them on their new journey. I didn't have a lot of people that looked like me. And so I got to talk to 7 of them. 3 of them were full quads like me, neck down. 1 was exactly like me. And talking to them, I ended it the same way I'm ending with us. Guys, look, you got to find your why. You got to know why you're here. And within that, you've got to learn to be grateful. Learn to say thank you. Learn to be grateful for what you do have. I'm so grateful that I have the ability to think, to converse, to interact with my wife and my kids. I stop in the neighborhood riding around and people are out and we keep our 6-foot distance, but just to see neighbors and to talk to them and encourage them, we can still manage our hearts even in the chaos. So as we go into the storm, let's hang on to God. Next week we're going to talk about how to ride the storm out. Actually, it gets worse from here, all right? And so I'll tell you, I mean, as far as this story goes, it gets worse for Paul. So we're going to see how he navigates even through the heart of this challenge, okay? Love you, bless you guys, and look forward to seeing you again. If this is before 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, I'll see you in a little bit on Facebook Live. If it's afterwards, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.